As we are now in the midst of the second wave of the COVID pandemic, what is the situation for the elderly people in the UK now? Dr. Duncan Robertson is a policy and strategy analyst academic at Loughborough University and focuses on COVID-19 modelling. He joins us now. Good morning to you.
Morning.
So obviously things were completely unprecedented the first time. We are supposed to have learnt lessons the second time. People who are less personally at risk sometimes discount the impact of COVID-19 more generally. You've been studying the data in this country and other countries. What is the time lag before older people get seriously affected by the virus when we're looking at the general population and then when older people begin to get it?
Yeah, so if you look at the population, it takes just under a week from to get it infected, and then another couple of weeks perhaps when you're in hospital, and then maybe another week or two to die. So it's a sort of 4 or 5 week process from when you catch the disease. And what we've seen in countries like France and Spain is it tends to start in the sort of 20-year-old population and then goes up inevitably to the working population. And if controls aren't put in place, then it goes to the old people, so people who are, for example, over 80. And, you know, we've known this for a long time. And the problem is that two months ago, we had a case rate of 8 per 100,000 in the over 80s. And last week, we have a case of 114 per 100,000 in the over 80s. And this is just terribly concerning because, of course, as your other callers have said, you're more likely to have a bad prognosis if you're elderly.
And can you quantify what that mortality rate is for older people over 85, I believe you've been studying in particular?
Well, yes. So, I mean, there are a lot of studies that have gone on. So I think it's important to distinguish what we call the infection fatality rate. So what that is basically, if you get it, how likely are you to die? And that will vary tremendously between country and country, depending on demographics. And for example, if you look at the number of people who are, over 65 in India, it's about 6%, but it's about 18% in the UK. And you can't even compare it to countries like Ireland, it's about 14% over there. But if you look at how likely you are to die if you're over 75 or 80, it's about 10%. So if you catch it, you've got a 1 in 10 chance of dying. And that's, from various studies in Nature and some, REACT studies from Imperial College. So the point is, you really need to prevent older people catching the disease because they have a very high mortality and it goes up and up the older you get.
And on the basis of the modelling that you've done, how is the second wave comparing to the first wave?
Well, it's difficult. So there are two things. One is to look at the analytics and what's happening. And the problem we have now, of course, is that you can look at the data, but the problem is that Test, Trace and Isolate, NHS Test and Trace, so the commercial system that's in place there, has been overrun. It's the virus is out of control in terms of R is greater than 1, and it's doubling. But we don't know what the cases are in the general population. But what we are seeing, so therefore, you can't really rely on these case data, but you can rely on things like hospital admissions rates. And we're seeing that go up exponentially across mostly older people. Unfortunately, it's not that significant when you get sort of under 20. And that's at least one good thing about the disease. But we've been looking, the Sunday Times investigation has been looking at the first wave. And what I think I'm concerned about is the fact that admissions for over 85s are going up exponentially into hospitals. But what we saw, if you remember these press conferences from Professor Van Tam, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, and Sir Patrick Vallance, the Chief Scientific Advisor, look at those charts carefully, because there's a chart there that says weekly COVID-19 ICU admission rates in England by age group. And what we saw between the 4th of October and the 11th of October is the number of people going into ICU, if they're over 85, has halved. So Why that is, I think, is a very interesting question, and one that perhaps needs investigation, because it may be the case that very similar things are happening than happened in March. And as you said, in March, it was unprecedented, but now it is precedented, right? We've got all this information. We've got half a year where we were able to come up with a strategy, or the government had time to come up with a strategy to prevent it happening again.
Dr. Duncan Robinson from Loughborough University, thank you so much for joining us this morning on Times Radio Breakfast.